During the past week, the Daily Growth Guide showed the strong resistance of Moses to God's call to servanthood. It seems he was absolutely determined to remain a nobody. I've often marveled over the stubbornness of this man, standing shoeless before God, speaking from a bush that burned without being consumed. Would you have had the impertinence to make 4 weak excuses during such an awesome encounter? It's always a struggle to enter servanthood when the source of our significance remains unsettled. Moses still faced that issue. He had to be significant by being a somebody. He had strived for greatness by attempting to deliver the Israelites using his own scheme and his own strength. And his failure caused him to find another way to be significant. Now he would become significant as a nobody, and he reveled in it. He said to himself, "Why should I try to be significant by doing any great deed? It's easier just to tend sheep and raise my family and take life easy. I'll be significant in a way that avoids the possibility of failing at what I do. I won't do anything again that I might fail at. I'll only attempt things I feel comfortable doing." Does that remind you of anyone you know? In the 1960s, a motto often heard was, "Tune in, turn on, drop out." Translated into English, it meant, "Striving for goals is useless. Take enough drugs to release you from reality. Withdraw from living a purposeful life." Well, Moses had dropped out. His life was purposeless. He was just making his money and doing nothing meaningful with his days. Now God calls him to return to a task he had failed to accomplish. He had no desire to feel uncomfortable again attempting something difficult. He had no plans to return to a land where he was known as a murderer. Of course, after 40 years, the statute of limitations had run out on the offense, but there was no limit to Moses' determination to remain a dropout. Moses had convinced himself that he was inadequate, a nobody. Did you notice in studying the Daily Growth Guide that every one of the 4 excuses he used were based on the way he saw himself? Look again at the 4 excuses Moses made to God and ask yourself how many of these are used by some Christians today. 1, I failed in the past. 2, I don't have enough knowledge about God to represent Him. 3, I'll be rejected. 4, I can't talk well enough. Those things were not really true about Moses, but it's the way he saw himself. Nobodies do not see themselves as they really are before God, because they sift everything through a screen of self-doubt. They're convinced they have a right to be useless. It's a total dropout. Now, we've seen the 4 excuses Moses used, but there were only 2 reasons he avoided God's call to servanthood. The first one was his fear of failure. He preferred living in the comfort zone, doing things he knew he could do successfully rather than attempting something new. His second reason was the fear of success. He didn't want to pay the price which would be required of him if the Israelites were released from bondage. There would be no more sitting on rocks watching sheep graze, looking for pictures made by white clouds. He'd be leading a nation. "No, thank you," he said. Being successful demanded too much of Moses. It was easier to drop out, and that's why he made excuses. The horrendous fact is that Moses lived without any concern for the suffering of 2 million Israelites during that period of time. Nobodies never count the cost to others which is being paid for them to be dropouts. If they did, it would keep them awake all night long. How many of God's adopted children do you think Moses represents? Like James, it's so comfortable for us to say, stay in the Father's house, to soak up the fine preaching, enjoying friendship with those who are fellow Christians, going to the covered dish dinners. Have you ever thought about the way our church buildings and activities are very much like Moses' desert where the sheep grazed? And meanwhile, not too far away from us, the children of Adam live enslaved. They live in needless bondage, while the adopted children of God have convinced themselves they are nobodies. They fear failure and they fear success. Ah, there is peace and contentment in the Father's house today. Lots of food on his table, and no one is turned away. There is singing and laughter as the hours pass by, but a hush calms the singing as the Father sadly cries, "My house is full, but my field is empty. Who will go and work for me today? It seems my children all want to stay around the table, but no one wants to work in my field. Push away from the table. Look out through the window pane. Beyond the house of plenty lies a field of golden grain, and it's white unto harvest. But the reapers, where are they?" There's a cold, hard fact that we can't escape. At the present time, it takes 40 Christians 1 year to produce one convert. That is so shocking. But you know, unless every one of us reaches 4 persons per year, each one of us, the world of 2050 AD may be less than 15% Christian. That fact doesn't excuse a single one of us from doing our part. In Moses' day, his nobody complex caused about 2 million Jews to suffer. In our day, we're talking about 2 billion. In Exodus 4:13, we see the final round of discussion between Moses and Jehovah at the scene of the burning bush. If you'll let me paraphrase this verse in modern language, I'll give you the spirit of Moses, the nobody, as he flatly refused to obey God's request. He was saying, "God, you're worse than a salesman with his foot in the door. You just won't quit. Now look, I've thrown every polite excuse in the book at you, and you just keep on demanding. So let me say it pointedly. You have a whole human race to choose from. Go and get anyone else in the world you desire, but get off my back. I'm a nobody, and I intend to stay that way." Are you stunned that anyone would dare to talk to God like that? I am. But the fact that Moses did so as an indication of how afraid he was to give up being a nobody. For 40 years, he had lived in an infant level of irresponsibility, a period of thumb-sucking self-pity. And he found it easy to say, "I can't be responsible for the Lord's work." Well, tragically, there are too many like Moses today. Are you one of them? Have you long ago convinced yourself that because of your age you cannot serve the Lord and set captives free? Or perhaps it's your lack of education, or has Satan pulled one of his best numbers on you and you've convinced yourself you are helplessly shy by your very nature? You know, shyness is a protecting shield we hide behind to keep from succeeding or failing. Or perhaps you feel that because of the church work you now do, someone else should worry about setting captives free. Or do we say, "My past is too evil. My problems are too great. My health is so delicate. My family is so insecure. God ought to have enough sense to let me remain a nobody." I just want to say one more thing about Moses' dialogue with God. Have you had those frustrating experiences of talking to someone who had a disagreement with you over something, and all the time you were speaking to them, the glazed look in their eyes signaled you that they weren't listening at all? The entire time you were talking, they were thinking about what they were going to say next to you. Well, that describes Moses. He never really listened to God. His mind was always busy thinking up new excuses. You know, nobodies don't ever have a listening room in their lives. Even when they talk to God, it's a one-way conversation. So when you're fighting being a servant, the last thing you need is a listening room. It's easy to see the alternatives Moses faced. Soon Jethro, his father-in-law, would die and leave him the farm. To follow God's request, he'd have to leave his comfortable life with Jochebed and the children. How did God respond to this flat refusal of Moses to obey? You know, it's very interesting. In Exodus 4:14 through 17, God really speaks sharply to him. In those 4 verses, Jehovah says you or yours 11 times in a row. Your brother Aaron is coming here to look for you, and he will find you. I will tell you what to tell him. You will speak well. I will tell you what to do. He will be your spokesman. You will be as God to him. Take your rod along so that you can perform the miracles I have shown you. You. A man plus God equals enough, Moses. There are no excuses which will permit you to withdraw from the reality of my call. Just exactly what was the call of God to Moses? It was not really a call to a task. It was a call to be a servant to the Master. That's the issue which faces every one of us. Forget about the task God might have for you and recognize that your basic commitment is not to comply with one activity he has for us. Instead, it's to accept his total ownership over us. I was on a retreat with 40 Chinese students in Singapore. We had gone to a bungalow in Changi, and we had taken a precious girl with us to cook the rice and pork and vegetables. She'd been raised in Buddhism, and when she failed her final exams in school, she took the elevator to the top of a 10-story apartment block, walked over to the edge of the roof, and jumped off. Bones were broken all over her body, and miraculously, she didn't die. So certain were the doctors that she would not survive that they did nothing to set her bones. She began to recover, bitter and angry that she wasn't dead. She threw her food against the wall, cursing the nurse who brought it to her. But that nurse had gone into nursing to set Adam's children free from their captivity, and she lovingly cleaned up the wall and the girl in the room week after week, and eventually her witness penetrated the girl's misery, and she trusted Christ as her Lord. And her bones were so twisted that she couldn't even walk across the room without someone helping her keep her balance. Her hands and arms were also unshapely. Well, at that retreat, I taught about servanthood. And she came to me with tears in her eyes. She said, "Uncle Ralph, you say God has a ministry for every one of us. I'm an exception. What can God do with someone as crippled as I am? I'm a nobody." And I said, "Oh, my dear, no. The best mihun and kway teow I've ever eaten in Singapore has been fixed by you at this retreat." And you know, 3 times this month, churches have called me to discover if I knew anyone who could cook for them on retreats or church socials. Have you ever thought that yours is the gift of service and that you are needed to do exactly what you're doing here as a ministry. Well, her eyes began to glisten. Yes, I can. I can do that. And so she began to put the word out to churches that if someone would help her walk, she'd cook for retreats. And when I returned to Singapore 2 years after returning to the United States for a visit, I spoke at a retreat again, and that young lady was our cook. And she said to me, Pastor, I'm booked up for a year ahead. God has a wonderful ministry for me. You know, perhaps as you view this videotape, the voice of the Holy Spirit is saying to your heart, you be my servant. I have need of your life. If you're hearing that voice, be certain that your life will change, your plans will be rearranged. But realize it's absolutely necessary for you to obey His call. He will take no excuse. The alternative to your not serving is so serious. It means that captives won't be set free. It means that people around you, you know, will live without Jesus Christ. That's too big a price to pay to remain a nobody. So this is the beginning of the rest of your life, the life of a servant